I think anyway, that's my experience anyway.
It's a little connection.
It's all those little small things that set you back, so. And I do know. I can go back and think this.
Do you know, I never thought of the shop.
Unless. Yeah.
Right, welcome everybody. Thanks for coming. Tonight, the Limerick Bridal Centre, in association with Poetry Day Ireland and April's Poetry Month, presents Poetry from the Deep Mind, a poetry reading and presentation by John W. Sexton, a performative examination of the Aisling Vision poem from the perspective of a 21st century Irish poet. John W. Sexton identifies with the Munster Aisling poetry tradition, and his poetry spans tangential surrealism, magic realism, and experimental metamorphosis. His 8th poetry collection, The Nothingness Kit, was published by Bear Buell Press in 2022. A chapbook of his surrealist poetry, Inverted Night, came out from Sir Vision Books in 2019. And his Aisling collection and manifesto, Visions at 10th of Glantown, was published by the Revival Press in 2020. His next full collection, The World Under the World, is forthcoming from Salmon Poetry. His poem, The Green Owl, was awarded the Listowel Poetry Prize in 2007 for Best Single Poem, and in that same year he was awarded a Patrick and Catherine Kavanagh Fellowship in Poetry. Please welcome John W. Sexton.
I couldn't believe that last bit.
On the night I was born, an owl crushed a mouse in its beak. A fox stole a hen. Tadpoles slithered from their jellied eggs. Beetles were swallowed by silent birds. Ants laboured in their kingdom of soil as I forced open my mother's womb. As the waters and blood gave way, the lizard adjusted beneath its stone. The earwig destroyed the opening bud. The weasel counted its hoard of bones. A man mistook death for sleep. A fish snapped at a drifting worm, and I took my first uncertain breath. That poem, The Defeat of Destiny, was written around 1995. After I had been a poet, and a published one, for 18 years. It marked a major change in my poetry path and brought me to where I am now. What I want to do this evening is look briefly at the relevance of the Irish Aisling tradition to 21st century Irish poetics, and allied as it is by the concept of Imbas Forosnai, which I will talk about briefly soon. This will also be largely charted by my personal experience over the past 44 years as a practicing vision poet. Just a few opening remarks before I start with regard to where I stand and where I come from personally as a poet. The ancient Greek poet Hesiod, he was active between 750 and 650 BC. He tells us in the introduction, in the introductory verses of his great work, the Theogony, that he was up on Mount Helicon, where he was greeted by the 9 muses. And when they came to him, they charged him with the duty of poetry. And they commanded him to write the Theogony, the origin of the earth and a history of the goddesses and the gods. And he accepted the position, he accepted the charge of poet. And once he accepted they gave him, as was tradition, his seal of office, a symbol of his office as poet. Now, in ancient tradition, your symbol or seal of office could be a lyre, a small stringed harp, or it could be a laurel crown, a crown of laurel. Some poets were given both, a stringed harp, a lyre, and a crown of laurel. And these were signs of the academy. The Muses gave Hesiod neither a crown of laurel or a lyre. They gave him instead, as his seal of office, a staff of laurel, a tall stick of laurel wood. And the reason they gave Hesiod a laurel staff was indicative of the thing that had brought him to the mountain in the first place. Because Hesiod was up there on those mountain meadows herding his sheep. Hesiod was a shepherd, a rural labourer, a working man. He was not of the academy. I say that because as a poet, as a working class, self-educated Irish poet, I stand with Hesiod. I also stand with Skeina. And who is Skeina? Skeina is the wife, the almost forgotten wife of our first poet, Imogen. Unlike Imogen, she is still here with us. Imogen just left his poem. But all the women of the Milesians and all the women of the Celts that were before the Milesians, the women that they were revered were named in the landscape. The mountain named after Mish, after Scotia. And Skeina didn't even make landfall to Ireland. Skeina died out there in the ocean. She died at sea before reaching Ireland. But when the Milesians made landfall, they named the stretch of sea between the Iveragh and the Beara Peninsulas, they named that after her. And it still bears her name, Imbas Forosnai. She is the mother of all poets spiritually in this land. And I stand also with Skeina. What I'm going to do now is talk briefly about the Ashland tradition and the concept of Imbas Forosnai. In the late 17th and 18th centuries, created by the great Kerry poet Egon O'Rahilly, the Ashling was a vision poem that outlined an encounter with a woman from the other world, a fairy or a heavenly woman. The name that Egon O'Rahilly gave to this poem was the Ashling, the vision poem, but the name he gave to this woman of the underworld was Unstera, the sky woman, which also means heavenly woman. The Ashling, though, had its precursors in much earlier pagan tradition, and the visions were largely goddess-centred and goddess-inspired. So the concept of the Ashling is a vision poem inspired by the goddess, the eternal goddess of complete being, who Egon O'Rahilly named Unstella, Sky Woman. This tradition is essentially the same as the muse or heavenly spirit tradition of many ancient religions and ancient poetries. Now, I want to say one negative about the Ashling tradition. It's really important straight away to state this negative. And the negative is that the Ashling tradition eventually became corrupted, and until it was essentially misogynistic and exclusive of women. And it became believed in our culture that if a woman in your family became a poet, then poetry would skip either 7 or 9 generations. And this was obviously a controlling device simply to keep women away from poetry, to keep poetry a male preserve. Those strategies have no place whatsoever in modern Ashling practice and should never have had. What I want to talk about now very briefly is just the concept of Imbas Forosnai. And Imbas Forosnai in the Irish simply means clairvoyance, and Forosnai is illumination. So Imbas Forosnai essentially is bright inspiration. And it's essentially the prophetic gift of clairvoyance or visionary practice that was reputed from even the most ancient of records to be granted to poets. In some traditions and amongst scholars, it's believed that the techniques of Imbas Forosnai were dependent on taking drugs, taking psychotropic or psychedelic drugs, naturally occurring ones, or also practices of sensory deprivation. We often hear of this idea that the Irish poet would retire to a cave and put a large rock on his chest until he began to hallucinate so much from the darkness and the pain that he would eventually be sprouting a poetry. Eleanor Knott, however, tells us that by the time we got to the late classical period, like the 16th and 17th century, the poets had dispensed with all that crack and instead were going to a darkened room where they would lie down on a little sofa and then they would have their moment of Imbas Forosnai. But of course, in many traditions, poets did not need the aid of drugs or the aid of sensory deprivation, because we know in many poetic traditions, including our own, that many poets were born with the gift of prophecy or the gift of poetry. The Welsh poets, Taliesin, Sappho, Hesiod, who I mentioned earlier, these are obvious examples, but there are also many obvious examples in contemporary poetry. Brendan Kennelly, without a doubt, was inspired. And many poets we can look at and we can say, that poet is inspired. I'm a poet who has spent actually the past 44 years practicing Imbas Forosnai. I don't use drugs. I don't actually have to. I dry hallucinate. It's something, it's a ducus from my mother. My brother Martin has it as well. And my brother Gerard, heaven rest him, he died in a car accident at the age of 18. He had it. And in my house, it was of great confusion to my father. In my house, the dead would often visit us, and we would all see them. And we would report these sightings to our mother, who would have seen them as well. And we would be consulting about this. And my mother, even in London, would often hear the banshee. It used to drive my father crackers, but he kind of just put up with it. The one thing that excited my father was that my mother always dreamt the winner of the Grand National.
Exactly.
However, because of a personal pishok, a superstition that she had, and it's a very real thing where you have a gift but you must not benefit from it. My mother wouldn't tell us who the winner of the Grand National was until the race had started to run on the television. And while the horses were running, my mother would begin to regale us with a dream she'd had the night before. And at the end of the dream, she would then say, "So I've been looking at the horses, and the one that represents my dream is this one, Ragtrade," or whatever the horse might be. And we'd sit there and we'd watch Ragtrade. Ragtrade came in at 40-1, and we'd watch all this guy, and of course that drove my father crackers. But the gift of prophecy, the ability to see and dreams and see things and hear voices, that's a ducus in my family. So luckily I had that as a foundation for practicing Imbas Forosnai and practicing the art of poetry. Now I want to mention someone who I think is very important when we talk about Imbas Forosnai. And in recent years, Imbas Forosnai, past 3 years, Imbas Forosnai has been repopularised in Ireland by the Laois poet Laura Murphy. Laura was actually reading this morning in Mount Mellick Library, and she was reading with 3 poets that we would be very familiar with here in Limerick, Arthur Broomfield, Anne Egan and Declan Furlong, 2 of which have been published by Limerick's Revival Press. Now, Laura was also instrumental, and this is her importance absolutely. She was instrumental in persuading the Irish government to dedicate the first day of Imbolc, the 1st of February, to Bridget as a national holiday. And this is a day held in equal reverence by both pagans and Christians. And that's important as a healing factor for our country, because on Bridget's day, Bridget is sacred to the goddess, but it's also sacred to the priestess Bridget, who was named for the goddess. And the priestess Bridget had her acolytes, her followers, all of whom were sisters who were women, and sisters in the wider sense. And the priestess Bridget converted to Christianity and became Saint Bridget. The thing about Bridget, and what makes her far more significant to us today, for both paganism, and I am a pagan, and Christians and Christianity, is that when Bridget converted to Christianity, she kept paganism. And her followers and the people of Laois and spread out throughout Ireland kept the pagan traditions associated with her. Whereas, and this is where I will offend people, Patrick, who was not of our land, came here, disdained and disrespected the pagan traditions so much that he lit bonfires where he was not supposed to. He banned things, he forbade things, he covered things up. He walked over the tradition, whereas Bridget, coming from it, brought the tradition with her into Christianity. Laura Murphy is very significant for me personally, because until she started to popularise the concept of Imbas Forosnai, I was really a poet, practising it largely in isolation. And it was great to suddenly discover now that this concept is going out throughout poets throughout the country. What I want to talk about now very briefly again, my beginnings as a poet, and two of the major influences that impacted on me as a vision poet. When I embarked on this path of poetry while still in England at the age of 19. Now, poets of my generation and the generation before me would often tell you that the rhythms of the Bible, the New and the Old Testaments, influenced us as poets. In fact, the great Limerick poet Michael Hartnett would often say that the rhythms of the Bible were very inspirational to him as a poet, especially in his earlier years. Of course, that's not the case anymore, with society becoming more secular and poets and most people not being so familiar with the Bible. Now, as a poet, especially when I got to my late teens, the Old Testament didn't really reach me anymore. I like the prophets, like Ezekiel, off their heads with visions. But the Old Testament is full of fighting, it's full of chauvinism. You know, God will choose me to beat the hell out of you and take your land because he's given it to me. I found that somewhat repellent. The New Testament was okay. I wasn't too keen on this Jesus now, but the Blessed Virgin, Mary, I could relate to. But of course, there was one book in the New Testament, or one set of writings, that I could relate to very much. And they were the Johannine writings. The Johannine writings, the writings associated with John, the disciple of Christ. His very unusual gospel, the Gospel of John, as you know, does not have a Last Supper. They meet in an upper room and they wash each other's feet. Now, I'll come back to this in a moment, but that action of men washing each other's feet is an old Judaic cult of Essenism, of the Essenic or the Essenes. And the Essenes were a cult in Judaism that put themselves aside. And they were the group of people that were in the caves around Qumran. And of course, John's final book, which is the final book in the New Testament, the Revelation, the Apocalypse, which is a visionary book. And I related very much to that. But I also related very much to the greater New Testament, the greater teachings of Jesus. Now, if you look at this, you're going to say to yourself, well, that can't be a New Testament because it's too big, it's too thick. But I was reading this from the age of 19. This is the standard version of the Apocryphal New Testament. These are all the stories of Jesus, his disciples, of Mary, all those characters of the New Testament, but told in the non-canonical books. These are the books that were suppressed by the Catholic Church. But they weren't suppressed at the beginning. At the beginning, this was the church. These are the books of all the early churches. But the reason these became suppressed is these were moving in a different direction to Christianity, because these were not Judaic. These were the churches that were formed in pagan places. So this is the testament of pagan Christianity. And it was the apocryphal New Testament that I was reading as a 19 and 20-year-old before I came to Ireland. As a 19 and 20-year-old Catholic. Because I wasn't really a Catholic. I was a Gnostic Christian. And Gnosticism, secret inner knowledge, is a thing that informs and informed the early Christian church and the early non-canonical Christian writings. They were canonical at the beginning. They were the writings belonging to these early churches. But the Great Catholic Church submerged them. They did what St. Patrick did. They trod them down. They trod them into the ground. This New Testament was my secret church, my refuge. Before leaving England, I discovered another group of writings. I discovered a poet. Not an Irish poet, not an English poet, not an American poet. I discovered Gunnar Ekelöf, a Swedish poet. Gunnar Ekelöf was born in 1907, and he was a visionary. He heard voices. He saw things. He had moments of pure ecstasy. He writes that in the 1930s, when he was living in Paris, he used to walk around with a loaded revolver in his pocket. And the reason he had a loaded revolver in his pocket was because he feared that any moment the voices, the visions, the ecstasies would stop. And he had vowed to himself that if they stopped, he was going to take the gun and blow his brains out. And he actually vowed that. Now, that indicates a very obsessive kind of poet.
At least.
At least, Tom. By 1932, he'd calmed down a bit. But by 1932, he'd calmed down a bit because now he had written down his ecstasies, his visions. And what he had in 1932 was his first collection, which was brought out in a limited edition by the Sexton Press. And his first collection in English is called Late Arrival on Earth. And anyone who knows me will know that my email address is Late Arrival on Earth.
Exactly.
Gunnar Ekelöf was a great inspiration for me. His later books, were written just before, the years before he died. They were written between 1965 and 1967. And in a very brief period, he wrote 3 collections: Diwan over the Prince of Enghien, The Tale of Fatima, and his final book before he died, Guide to the Underworld. And these collections were composed of poems that were spoken directly into his mind. He said of the first book, Daimon, that someone else was dictating the poems to him. And he said he'd never had such an experience as intense as that before in his mystical life. Gunnar Ekelöf died of cancer in 1968. He died of cancer of the throat. His final illness, his final cruel illness, was to still his voice, to take his tongue from him. But discovering Gunnar Ekelöf at the age of 19 and 20 granted me permission to allow my psychic sensibility to be a tool for poetry. And I was, in those days, before coming home to Ireland, a Gnostic Christian. I have been a Gnostic all my life. Today, I am a Gnostic pagan. I will die a Gnostic pagan. And so, at the age of 24, I came to Ireland at the beginning of the 1980s, after spending my first apprenticeship as a poet in England. And I came to Ireland and I started my long second phase of my poet's apprenticeship. I had neither the craft or the self-confidence to write as a vision poet based on my own self-experience. And the truth is, at the age of 24, I didn't have much self-experience. I hadn't lived enough yet. So I spent the most part, over a decade, 12 years in fact, on a Gnostic rewriting of Christian myth. My first decade of poetry was an investigation of the Apocrypha, a personal Apocrypha, a personal Gnostic knowledge as a creative way into poetry. And I completed that 12 years of poetry in 1995. And in 1996, this appeared as a very slim volume of poetry. There we have 12 years of work. I'm going to read briefly, possibly just one poem from this. And then I want to go back to the very beginning. Christ in the garden. In the garden, metal flowers bleed dark noise, rust coming off from those lips, petals impaired by the last watering. No more coherence now that pain has come. Decay has arrived. As dust falls imperceptibly from between stones, the stones will speak, a kind of speaking, a small lament, perhaps a slight knock. Scissors would speak more decidedly than these stones would silence the flowers. But the scissors, of course, loses its tongue to the dumb, insidious violence of the stones. Can you not stay awake? Do you no longer know who I am? Pilate's wife is dreaming this. After completing the prince's brief career, I was now, after 12 years, at an impasse. It was at this time that the poems of a true Ashley nature began to form themselves in my mind. It was at this time that I wrote the opening poem that I read to you at the beginning of this talk. I'm going to read another two from this period as well. Just to give an idea of how the Ashley, the vision poem, was beginning to form for me, and how I was beginning to find a way to do it as then, because we were still in the 20th century, as a 20th century poet. On an August night, the sea reclaims its own. The sea was awake, sleeplessly grinding its teeth, and although warned that it was a thief and would steal the breath of those who went too near, nevertheless she chanced to go there. She could hear the water mutter its incessant troubles, scattering its thoughts amongst consonants of pebbles. And as she ventured by the stars' weaker light to the very edge of the pier, midnight aged 1 minute, and she could hear the water call her, daughter, daughter, daughter. It was at this time that suddenly, from nowhere, in a poem, I found myself addressing the goddess of complete being. It was at this time that I found myself in a poem addressing the muse, addressing Unspera. It came when I was thinking of the idea of the goddess, and also thinking of my first goddess, who was my mother. Our mammies are our first goddess, after all. So I was thinking of my mother, and I was thinking of the goddess. And I have to say, my mother, even though my mother saw things and heard things, and was as off her head as I am, my mother was a devout Catholic. My mother said her prayers every night. She said her prayers every morning. There was a rosary beads by her all the time. She read us as good Catholics. She wanted her 5 sons to be good boys. What drove her was a misplaced guilt. I didn't know this for certain until I was past 50. But my mother had given birth at least once to a child before me. I was not any longer her firstborn. She had given birth, at least one that I know of, to a daughter, my sister, by another father. My father was prepared to adopt this girl. No one in the family, until after my mother died, knew the secret. But because I'm a poet, I blabbed the secret to everybody.
Same for us, John W.
Absolutely.
You're not going to talk?
The thing is, there was no shame in that, as we told her. But she was praying all her days after that, because the church she believed in had nailed her with guilt. Anyway, thinking of my mammy and the pagan goddess, I addressed them both in this poem. Sonnet to the goddess of words. You led me to a room inside your head, and feeling drowsy, I lay down and died. You told me that I was not really dead, but no shouting could arouse me. You lied. I had a bag of omens from my mum, with whose magic I would be unsmothered. A bee, a golden hair, a chrysanthemum. The bee had flown, the hair grey, the flower withered. And even the heavy sweater my mammy knitted unravelled on a protruding, rusty nail. And all those years of learning I regretted, my apprenticeship to you of no avail. I cannot wake up, but can only tread stealthily and rewind the unwound thread. With that poem came a realization that the nothing I had at that point, after 18 years as a poet, was something. It was the only something I had, and it was poetry. The moment of composition of that poem was to formulate my ideas on a national poetic, and I began publishing and writing essays from the beginning of the new millennium. The first of which came out over 20 years ago and appeared in the spring 2001 issue of Poetry Island Review, edited then by Biddy Jenkinson. And the essay in that was called The Goddess of Merciless Love. I see Unsteran, the pagan goddess of the ashland, as so loving that her love is merciless. It's sometimes hard to bear. A year later, the Connemara poet Mary O'Malley commissioned me to write another essay for an RT radio programme, for a strand of spiritual talks that was appearing on the radio on a Sunday. And I suppose I was the token pagan. Mary made me laugh because she said, now John, and she whispered this, she said, you can say anything you want, but don't use the C word. And I thought, Jesus God, and I thought, the C word. And then something dawned on me, and I said, this was on the phone now, I said, Mary, what is the C word?
Christian.
And she said, Celtic. Now, that was a relief, because the word Celtic would never pass my lips. With the publication of those essays, I suppose you could say that I was beginning to out myself. I was beginning to have the confidence to out myself as not simply a pagan, but a pagan poet, where the idea of the vision of Unspearman, the vision that Aegon O'Rahala had in the 18th century, was now relevant to me, to someone writing poetry. And I know I couldn't have been the only poet working on this. I wasn't the only poet thinking about this. And that's been proven in the past 3 years with the work of Laura Murphy. Because now, with the concept of Imbas Forosnai going out amongst poets, more poets are actually coming out of the closet, as it were. My poetry tends always now to be revolves around vision poetry, and by vision poetry I mean there's a vision poem in my very first collection of autos. It's the title poem, and it's about my autistic son Matthew. It's about my experience with him and the visions I had around him. So vision poetry isn't poetry about something up there in the sky. It should be based in the here and now, and based in what concerns us now. However, as a poet, I suffer from a malaise that many of you as poets will be familiar with, and that's called writer's block. And I get a lot of writer's block. Actually, I am one big writer's block. And normally I strategize towards it. But in 2009, I had such an awful period of writer's block, I was paralysed. And I used all the strategies that I'd been using in previous years, and none of them worked. So I thought to myself, well, I'm going to have to think of something new here. So I thought, well, hang on, I've got writer's block and I'm a poet. But what if there was a poet who didn't have writer's block, and I invited him into my brain, and he could write inside my body on my behalf, and it wouldn't bother me, and I wouldn't bother him because I'm not writing at the moment. He'd have space to write. Now, that might sound comical, and the way I tell it, purposely, it sounds comical. But actually, what it was a summoning of other. I created a poet, I gave him a name, Jack Bray Curtingstall. I gave him a biography, and then I cut him loose inside my mind. And I was now a bystander. I was a spectator of him writing poems through me. Of course, because he was inside my mind, he had access to my memories. He had access to me. He had access to my life. He also actually had access to my theories. I'd had this theory that I've been working on. I was telling my fellow Kerry poet, who many of you know, Eileen Sheehan, I've been kind of regaling her with this theory of free elastic form, which was, I envisaged as a formal poem that wasn't formal. It was free, but it was self-replicating. And I could see it, I could touch it, but I couldn't write it. Of course, when Jack Bray Curtingstall entered my mind, being far smarter than me, and not being burdened by writer's block, he stole free elastic form and started to write in it. And it was great, because as soon as he had finished, as rent for living inside my mind and body, I took all his poems. Here is the opening poem from that, and I want to read it to illustrate how our lives and the here and now and memory can be used as a visionary poem, can be used as a triumphant talking to and of nature, and talking to and of the human nature of us. Famous mice. The one my father trapped in the stainless steel kitchen sink and drowned under the hot tap. The 3/4 moon, a cut queen through the net curtain. The one whose bite I nibbled from a half biscuit, breathing in its rank whiff. A coconut macaroon, a sweet moon. The one who stopped the washing machine for a week, and then the man came in a blue bib and brace, and the mouse was a pulp splodge in the works. The one I cornered in the skirting board and set free, believing it was me. The one I imagined curled in the grey right eye of the moon. The one our neighbour's cat brought live from the railway embankment. The day moon's face, inscrutable in the afternoon sky. The one I never saw but heard the pattering of. The one yet to be born, the one yet to be caught, the one in the broken moon of my skull when I die. The grey one, the brown one, the door one, the grass one, the field one, the hazel one, the one. In 2019, as Dominic knows, I was appointed as the inaugural Poet Laureate of Limerick City and Limerick County, thanks to Dominic Taylor and the Limerick Writers' Centre. It was a very important year for me because at the beginning of 2019, in February, before the tenure of the laureateship started, I had an intense visionary period, and I began to write those visions down. And I also began to add notes from visions and insights I've had over the years. And those poems, that sequence, became the title sequence of the collection that the Revival Press brought out the following year. But also, as soon as I entered Limerick for my tenure, I began to think of one of the Make poets in particular, and the Make poets in general, and another vision poem came out of that, and that's in here as well. And towards the end of the year, I was lucky to receive a residency in Tipperary in the Dromini and Nina Literary Festival, and I was their writer in residence. And again, in that same year, I had a very intense visionary experience, and I wrote a poem called Mochavon na Heffernan in Tira Namon, Mahan o Heffernan in the Land of Women. And Mochavon na Heffernan was a great Tipperary poet who, like all poets, many Irish poets, died in poverty and died unknown, and his last years are really unknown to us. Outside of his poetry, he disappeared. So I'm just going to read, we're kind of running down for time now, so I'm just going to read one poem from this. Now, these poems don't have titles. The title of the sequence is Visions of Temple Grantham. So I'm just going to take one of these towards the end. The sun lights the birch leaves greener. At a clearing, a fox stands before you. You remember him well. Can see the mark you left in his skull with your stick. Can see the eye hanging from his face from the day you brained him. You had killed him that day on a rocky outcrop where the dogs had cornered him. Good morning, says the dead fox. Good morning, you say. You have no dogs with you today, says the dead fox. No, you say. One took poison left out for a fox, and the poison killed him. One died from old age. One went out a day and never returned. The pupil in the eye hanging from the dead fox's face shines green as birchlight. Let me become your dog, says the dead fox. You are surprised. You want me to domesticate you, to bring you home? No, says the dead fox. Let me be your dog, and I will guide you to the place where the lost dogs gather. I will bring you into my den and domesticate you. This is a fair bargain for taking my life. I can return the dead to you. You follow the dead fox. Your mind is filled with understanding. You and the fox step into green. A multitudinous barking tunes you to the bone. I'm going to finish now. I was going to finish with a different poem, but last night I had an awful dream. It was an Ashling dream. It was, when I woke up from it, I realised that I'd been kicked up the arse by heaven. It was a dream of poetry as a child that is given to the poet to foster. And in the dream, I had a child. It was given to me. It was somebody else's, and I knew that the child was poetry. You know, in dreams when something is just there and you know it. And I had this child, and the child was a boy, and he was naked, and he was beginning to whinge, and I took him out into the meadow, and he was beginning to get comfortable, and I put him down on the grass, and of course I began to look at the sky, and I began to listen to the birdsong, and the baby on the grass began to grumble, and he began to fidget, and he began to get troublesome. And I thought to myself, oh, I better feed him. And I thought, but what will I feed him? So I left the child in the grass, and I went into the house, and for some reason I began to make, for the baby, a banana sandwich.
As you do.
And when I had finished making the banana sandwich, I came out into the meadow, and the baby now had rolled about, and he had fallen off a little verge into a gentle little hollow of bare earth. And he was there grumbling away. And I said, it's okay, I'm going to feed you now. And I opened up the corner of the sandwich to break it up, to give it to the baby. And as I opened up the banana sandwich, I could see that for some inexplicable reason, it had rings of onion inside it. That somehow I had made an onion and banana sandwich for the baby. And I thought, what were you thinking? And the baby was now beginning to get very distressed and said, it's okay, I'm going to bring you something in a minute. And I was faffing around, and when I turned around, the baby is gone. In a panic, I slid down into the earthen hollow. And as I came down into the bare earth, I could see a little boherine, a pathway in front of me. And I could see very quickly that it was very short and that there was a garden that it led into. And I stepped into the garden, and to the left-hand side, I could see a cottage, a small cottage, and the walls of the cottage were covered in greenery. And there was greenery growing up into the roof and around the chimney. And in the garden, running around, were young children, all of them girls. And out of the house came a young woman. I thought perhaps she's the elder sister or the young mother of these children. And I said, at this stage I was getting very worried because I had lost a baby. And I said, excuse me, but have you seen the baby? And suddenly, as soon as I said it, I could see through the open door of the cottage that the baby was inside, crawling around the floor. And I said straight away, oh, it's okay, I see it. And I stepped through the threshold into the cottage. And I picked the baby up. And he began to grumble again. And he began to get distressed. And I could hear the woman speaking behind my back. And she said, he's hungry, give him to me. And she took the baby from me. And she sat down on the chair. And as she sat down, I could see that there was another baby in a rocker by her seat. And she began to lift her clothing. And I thought, oh my God, she's going to suckle the child. So I turned my back on her as a courtesy. And as she was feeding the child from her breast, I was saying, without looking, I was saying, oh, thank you so much for doing that. I'm very, very grateful. And when she was finished, and the child seemed content, I turned around and she was fully clothed again. But now the child was grown up. He was a toddler. He was 2 years of age, and he was fully dressed. And he was very smartly dressed. And he was running around the place. And of course, I was looking at this mother, and she was standing up, and she was looking at me, and she was very young, and I'm 65, and of course I'm a man, and I'm a complete idiot, and she started to talk, and she was very impressive now, let me tell you. And I was trying to impress her, but everything I said was idiotic. Everything that came out of my mouth was completely foolish. And everything that she said made her look more and more impressive. And she said, I'm a poet. And I said, so am I. And I started to try to talk about poetry. And all that would come out of my mouth was complete and utter nonsense. And the child, fully clothed and getting bigger, was now running around the place. And the woman suddenly said to me, we have to go. And of course, because she was a young one, I thought to myself, oh, I'll have to go with her. So I said, oh, let me come with you. And as I said that, she began to put a long black cloak over her shoulders. A long black cloak with a heavy wooden cowl at the back. And I said, I have a cloak like that. And suddenly there, in my hands, was a long black cloak with a hood. And I threw it over my shoulders. And I was trying to adjust it. And I was talking to her, and I was talking complete idiocy. And as I was talking complete utter nonsense to her, I was trying to fix the cloak, and I couldn't find the hood. I couldn't find the hood of the cloak, and it wasn't sitting on my shoulders properly, and it was catching my throat. And I said, oh, hang on a minute, and I looked behind me to see what was wrong with the long black coat, and I could see that the black cloak was hanging on me upside down, and the hood was behind my ankles, under my arse. And to save face, I tried to make a joke about poets wearing their cloaks upside down. But now she was moving out of the cottage, and all the young girls that were with her were now growing. They suddenly teenagers, and they were walking with her, and they were walking apace, and I began to follow. Now she no longer had a black cloak, and I no longer had mine. And we left the meadow, and in front of us was an escalator. And the women, and now they were women, they were no longer teenagers, they were all young, vibrant women. They began to pass us by and go up the escalator, and she was just in front of me. And it was the best I could do to keep up with her. She was getting ahead of me. And as we were coming up to the top of the escalator, I said to her, it's a bit of a trouble now to be keeping pace with you. I'm 65. And without stopping, she looked over her shoulder and she said, are you stumbling? And then I came up to the end of the escalator and they were all gone. And I turned around and the escalator was no longer moving. It was solid. It was now solid steps. And I looked down and suddenly I thought, I forgot the baby. I've left the baby behind. And I ran down the steps, through the meadow, scrambled down into the earthen hollow, and that's all there was. The bohoreen was gone, the garden was gone, the house was gone, the child was gone. And I woke up. And I woke up in a swelter. The sweat was pouring off me. I was dizzy, I felt ill, and I felt shameful. Because, as Tom realised, when a woman in a dream has a long black coat, she is a fairy woman. She is a woman of the she.
She's trouble.
She is an agent of the goddess.
Oh, yeah.
That child that I was supposed to foster, poetry, was nursed by the goddess as a suckling mother, as a nursing mother. That child grew, not through my agency. Through my agency, that child was lost. I was so busy chasing her that I forgot poetry. And that was a dream I woke up with on the eve, the very day of giving this talk on Ashland poetry and Imbas Forosnai. And that's the goddess for you. She will kick you up the ass.
She will. Rightly so.
If I can now, I'm going to finish.
You couldn't follow that, John.
I am. I'm going to finish actually with a poem, because I was going to read something else, and I wasn't going to have a Ramesh like that, but then I had that dream. And when I came out of that dream, not immediately, because I honestly felt ill, and I honestly felt shamed, and I knew what the dream meant. I knew it was an Ashling. And sometime later, after I was able to steady myself, right? And that's what happens now, Tom, when you follow young ones. I remember this poem. I want to read this poem actually because this was published in the Stanzas chapbook, which was a series, beautiful series of magazines that came out of UL, the University of Limerick, a few years ago. This poem is actually about poetry as a young woman. It's about poetry as a young female poet. And in this, I had the vision, the idea of a woman poet meeting male poets and really having enough of them and leaving. Before I read the poem, though, I just want to show it to you. It's a fairly kind of middling length poem. This is a breed of sonnet called a submerged sonnet. And what that means is that in a longer iambic poem, you have a sonnet submerged or drowned. This actually is a form of submerged sonnet called a collided sonnet. And this is where two sonnets have collided with each other. Now, if one body travelling at speed collides with another one, a meteorite perhaps, heat is produced. And heat purifies. But also impact causes damage and ejecta. And one body might be more damaged than the other. Both bodies might be damaged, but one body might survive. You can never tell with collisions. And anyway, this is a submerged, collided sonnet. Now, I mention that for this reason. No matter what poetry we practice, whether it's haiku, formal poetry, free verse, whether we're rap poets or spoken word poets, in our separate traditions, we should simply try to attend to craft. And in the Ashling tradition, when you look at those poets and the forgotten, submerged, trodden on women poets, all of them practiced their craft. So I just mentioned that, but I mention it for another reason as well. You can't see a poem when you hear it, but you can hear it. Perhaps you might hear one sonnet breaking into another, but maybe you won't. What you'll hear, I don't know. Anyway, this is the poem. It's called "The Muse Had Left, but the Poets Missed Her Leaving." On the path of gold, her high heels impaled dog turds of every shade of brown, their soft hearts still liquid in their shit. The dogs coughed from the lampposts they were chained to. She hailed a taxi, black as a coach horse beetle, and it sent her a cold curve of puddle. Drenched, she took a lone seat in the back, nailed to it by her freezing arse. The driver took her to the edge of town. Now, barefoot, she turned her back on the last golden street, and her feet in the wet grass shone silver. Behind her, the city hummed in its noise. The workings of its innards never still, but here she was beyond the city's will, free at last of its never-ending lies. In the dark, frogs began their fart-mouthed hymns. This was a language untainted by thought. She listened, blissful, while the white moon wrought its equalizing light upon her limbs. Bright, under moonlight, the river meadow mimed a pure song of both light and shadow. Thank you.
Magical, mystical, mischievous John W. Sexton on the Ashling. Some of us are now going to spend the evening tracking down that woman in the black cloak for aesthetic reasons. Anyway, that was the penultimate gig in this sacred place. But tomorrow is the final lash, and it's final event of April is Poetry Month in Limerick. And it's the launch of poet Kieran Bevel's latest collection of poetry, The Archaeology of the Heart. It will be launched by poet and author Kieran O'Driscoll. All are welcome. And now, I'm a nervous wreck because I was wondering where John W. was going. And by God, he got there with a vengeance. Thank you for being a wonderful audience, all